There we are. So hope everybody is still active because this is nearing the end of the conference. But I think I have a couple of nice slides for you as well. We are sort of transitioning from the Panda CSS to plain old CSS, and I don't care how you write it as long as you use it. First thing about me, I'm indeed Joran. Alex did a proper introduction, so I'm not going to add anything to this. One thing that is nice to know is that I used to work on our design system. So that's where the context is coming from, where I put the contents of this presentation together. Feel free to follow me on the socials. You know where to find me. And it is also good to know that I am not a specialist. I'm just an average developer for an average company, just a regular Joe who happens to share his journey and also come clean on my CSS discoveries. A bit about my organization. So indeed, I work for a grocery chain, and that means that we are a non-primary tech company. I think that's a good thing to mention as well. It does play a part in our organization, but the bottom line is that we don't make our money with tech. We make our money with some other core business. And that might be applicable to you as well. That's why I'm sharing this, because this affects the attention and focus that we have on our digital products as well. So some of our goals we are fulfilling with tech. But we also, or at least I noticed, that we're also very much invested into JavaScript progression rather than CSS progression. And this was sort of a wake-up call that led me to putting these slides together as well. As I said, I used to work on our design system as a tech lead. A couple of things that come into play here is that we still use Sass. Whether that's a good idea, we'll share later. And we also use the mixins and variables in Sass. Still, if that's a good idea, I don't know. We'll see about that. It's built in Vue, so it is still tied to a certain tech stack. If you paid close attention to Lucian's talk, that might also not be a good idea. But this was built from a developer up approach. So we just built what we need along the way. Now let's get started. There's a thing about CSS. We all know this one, right? And I think it applies to me at least. So I can't speak for all of you, but I noticed that in our organization, we start to leverage more and more the JavaScript and TypeScript-oriented frameworks and features. And that led us to drift away from one of the main pillars of the web, which is, of course, CSS. And for our organization, and I think we might not be unique here, CSS was not our main focus anymore. And that can lead to lower maintenance on the CSS code. That's something that I want to address here. Meanwhile, so I am, as a diligent developer, I'm reading the blog posts and following the Twitter and seeing the headlines about what CSS can do. But I was also in the headspace of, this is probably not supported properly, or I'll stick to what I know. Or so what's this one good feature going to do for me? And it took me a while before it clicked. Because meanwhile, browser vendors, they are actually cranking out a lot of support for the new features at a high pace. The update strategies of the browser vendors are very much more reliable than they used to be. So IE is definitely out of the question for everybody. And I was around when IE was still a thing. So that was my headspace when I started this investigation. And on top of that, the working group is also implementing features with a spot-on, very good developer experience as well for adopting those new features. And we'll see an example I think in a couple of slides. So this was going to be a crash course to the features of current CSS, or my confessions as a web developer realizing the knowledge gap that was created because I wasn't paying attention to what CSS can do. So I'm updating the title to things I didn't know CSS can do. Bear with me. We're going to go for quite a ride because now I do know some of the things that CSS can do. Let's go. So we'll have a look at a couple of, actually a generous amount of examples, and I'm going to highlight some of the key capabilities. It's just so much that it probably doesn't even fit in the slot. So I'm going to keep a good eye on my timer. And if I see I'm running out, I might skip some slides. But I also want to stress before I dive into this that I want to show you that it's okay not to know things. But once you do know that you have a knowledge gap, you can take action to fill that knowledge gap. So let's get started. One of the first features I did not know about, I read the headlines, I read the news, but it didn't click with me. It's actually nesting, and this is a no-brainer. If you use a preprocessor or a compiler, you're already using this. So the jump from, in our case, Sass to just plain old CSS is virtually non-existent. To take a look at this example, it's very straightforward. We see a regular H2 definition here. And if we take a look at the other one, there it is nested. And it's just supported out of the box. Simple as that. I can't make it any more easy for you to adopt this. Let's go to the next one. As I said, I'm going to go through a lot of examples, so bear with me. So scoping, and I think this is a really cool one. If we are using our design system as a single file component setup, we're using Vue, which very well fits within that paradigm. So we already have our CSS scoped. And if you use another framework, you might already use CSS and JS that scopes, or any other ways of scoping CSS. But CSS supports this out of the box as well. But it does something extra that makes it really interesting. It also offers you control over the limits of the scope. So let's take a look at an example. So here we have a typical reusable component. We have a card over here, which has a title and a slot. So in the slot, you could place whatever you like. Well, normally, if you start to style this, see what the highlights is doing. Yeah, so what we do here is we define the scope of the CSS styles, that it only applies to the cards, and it runs up until the slot. So the slot itself, whatever is in the slot, is not affected by any styles that you define here. And that's super cool, because that means you have much more control over this element, and you keep the control over whatever you put inside of that element, because you break up the cascade here. So as you can see, this is the title. This is effectively what's being styled by this block. And that's perfect for a reusable component where you can just slide in other parts in that slot. This is a really good example of scoping. And this has a known concept of a donut scope. This is basically a iteration of what we just saw, but donuts are yummy, so I'm just adding this in. But what you see is that we have a ring of elements, the donut, the topping, and the chocolate over here. But we also have a hole inside of this element, which is the unscoped style. And this leads to having a donut scope. So this is also a concept. I didn't come up with this. You can look this up, but this is tasty CSS, I think. By setting the bounds, we can effectively create that area of element with a specifically non-selected hole, which is really cool. So scoping is awesome in CSS. It might be one of my favorite features, not just because it's tasty. Another one is container queries. So we all know, I hope, media queries. They are really good for doing responsive layouts, but they fall short, however, if you have elements that are either inside of a grid, inside of a certain element, or outside of a grid on a page. You can't use media queries for that. You have to use something else. And in this case, container queries are the key. You consider that card element that can exist. If it's in a grid, you want it to be smaller. If it's outside of the grid, it might take a different shape. You can use container queries for this. Now the syntax is a bit is a bit more verbose than using a media query, because for the media query you just target the viewport. In this case, you need to define what the container is, where you want to target your query on. And you do that by defining the type of the container. You can even give it a name for general purposes. It makes it easier to attach the styling to that container query, or to that container. And if we have a regular card here that's outside of the container, we can just style it the way we want it, defining what type of flow it should have. And then we can also put some extra styling in place to make sure that if it is inside of that container, or that can be your grid, or that can be some other layout, we can take then the width of that container and style the component or the element accordingly. So in this case, we're modifying the flex direction based on the width of the card container. And that's really cool. Something you cannot do with media queries, something you would need JavaScript for, or extra classes, but now you can do it with plain old CSS. And that's awesome. This is another example. I'm going to skip over this one for now due to time constraint. In line with container queries, we also have container units, so new units to play around with. And these are also should be very familiar with you if you know the view width, view height units. Now you have the CQW, sorry, I'm Dutch, CQH, so that for the container height. And they allow you to specify the size of elements inside of that container based on a percentage of that container. There's a quick note here, so prefer CQY and CQB. We'll get to that in a couple of slides, but I promise we'll get to it. But they are virtually the same as the CQW and CQH. So this is also another good example where you have extra control over how you want to target and style your stuff. Perfect. Subgrid is also, in terms of extensions, this is also another extension of the grid, of course. I would say this is a logical progression of what the grid should have been from in the first place. And it's also coupled to the grid that you attach this from. So for instance, if your main page layout has 12 columns, then smaller grids inside of it also have that 12 layout or column layout as well. And you can then exert more control over that subgrid in relation to that top level grid, the main grid, so to speak. A quick example here is, so for instance, say we have a list of articles, and some articles have really long titles. That's not uncommon in web design or web development. What would happen normally is if you put them side by side, and the paragraph text that's below the H2 would be all over the place. It would not respect the vertical rhythm. But by defining a subgrid that is applicable to all of the articles here, because they have the subgrid class, we can make sure that that vertical rhythm is respected. So all of the paragraphs will start on the same vertical height. And that's also something that's really hard to do without the usage of this subgrid. Or you have to resort to Flexbox or other means, but they have very little knowledge of what the entire grid looks like. So subgrid is just a logical extension of what the grid is. And it's nice to have that sort of control. Yep, there we go. And this was an interesting one, the cascade layers. So we all know CSS stands for the cascading style sheets. And the cascade means basically in this case that the whole style definition cascades with the specificity to determine the applied styles to an element. And these layers were already in place. We didn't have control over them. We already had the user agent style sheets, that's your browser settings. You probably remember a reset CSS, but you can also have user settings that come into play. And then we have the author style sheets, and that's where we developers do our day-to-day job. These are already layers, but what the cascade layers introduce is more control over that author style sheet to break that up into smaller layers as well. And that is really cool because it effectively puts breakers or stops in the cascade, at least in the specificity of the cascade. And that breaks up the cascade into smaller little chunks where you have much more control over what style gets applied where. I really like this. I think we have an example. Yeah, this is how you define them. So you have the add layer property, and you define the named layers here. So the reset base and utils. And then later on in your CSS, if you have the add layer base, you can add whatever styling you want to put in there. Now notice the order of things. We have reset base and utils here. But if we note it like this, because there's also a shorthand where you can immediately define a layer and put styling in it. Now we change the order of things because the base is now, his occurrence is now after utils. So that mixes up the specificity and the applied style. So that's something to keep in mind when you're working with this. But this whole cascade situation gives us a lot more control over anything. Also, if we want to import external styles into our layers, we can do something like this. So we can use the import statement and immediately put it in a layer with a name. And this gives us, again, much more control over external or third-party libraries or any other sets of styles where we have little control. We can import them so that we at least control the specificity or where it gets applied. And I think that's really useful as well. There's a couple of other notations. So you can have an anonymous layer, which just affects the, well, you can't really reuse this because it's anonymous, but it affects the scope of the applied styles. Also, don't use Comic Sans in your designs. And you can also have nested layers where you break up the utilities, for instance, with a topography layer. You can mix and match those. There are a couple of, well, there are two types of notations here, the shorthand or the more extensive one. But these cascade layers, they're a really cool feature that's added in CSS as well. A couple of selectors, you might have already seen a couple of these. The is selector is particularly interesting because it allows you to really concisely group the amount of selectors you have to write. If you take a look at the example that we see here, we have a section, article, aside, nav with an H1. And we have to write them out fully using plain old CSS rules, ancient ones now. But if we use the is selector, we can group the first bit and then have the H1 as a second part, and that makes the code much more readable. And there's another thing, because the is also much more forgiving. Say I have these selectors and the unsupported one is unsupported by any browser, then the styles within this selector will not be applied because the browsers will not make sense of this selector group. Using the is selector, the browser doesn't care because it only takes a look at the things that it can support and then applies the style. So it's a much more forgiving way of grouping your styles as well, which I think is really cool. This one, the has selector, has been popping up on my feeds everywhere because everybody is very excited about it. It's very useful, so I concur. But it makes it very easy to style elements based on the contents of the element. So in this case, an article, we can apply some styling, and as soon as we define a has with a when we have a selector that is applicable to a child in that article or in that element, we can apply different styles to the article itself. So this is a way of sort of, again, breaking out of the cascade, which I think has been an issue for a lot of developers for quite some time. But this makes it much more easier to target elements inside of selectors and inside of elements. So this is also a very great use of a selector. I'm saying selector a lot because this is about selectors. You can also nest there we go, selectors that you want to target. So that's really cool. And then on top of that, you can also then nest a additional selector to target, in this case, the hero image that's inside of an article that has a hero image. This creates some interesting use cases and a lot of flexibility in how you write your CSS, where you would normally have to rely on JavaScript to analyze a document for you. Now you can have CSS and in this case, or in turn, the browser do the work for you. We're moving on to some colors here. So again, if you come from compilers like SAS, color mix is already something that might be very familiar or familiar to you. And we can use this in CSS as well. And the good thing here, or the nice thing here, is of course that if we use CSS variables like this, we can play around with setting some colors. But these get updated, right? So if I change this base color on the fly in the browser without pre-compiling or compiling it from SAS, everything here gets updated. And I'm not saying that it is a really good idea to base your entire color palette off of these color mix functions, but you could do this. And this offers interesting opportunities. But you can also use other functions that are now in CSS, like the color contrast, to check whether the outputted scheme is actually worthwhile. There are better ways, by the way, of generating color schemes. Look it up. The Oki LCD function is much more suitable, but this is just an example, right? Another interesting one, and this is more in terms of supporting more browsers. So this is a progression in the color space where we accommodate current monitors and screens. So if you see this image and it only shows one bar, then you might have an outdated screen or there's something wrong with the stream. But the bottom bar is the P3 color space. And the thing about the P3 color space is this is a good example. The P3 color space is this entire image, and the RGB only exists on the left-hand side of that white line. I hope that white line is visible. But as you can see, there you have much better, much more coloring, much more vivid colors available to you using P3. And it's also available. You can check for support in CSS. So rather than doing this notation, the RGB, you can use the color function to target the display P3 color space. And then you use normalized values instead of the 0 to 255. And now we're going to get in a squeeze on time. So I think this will be the last one, and then I'll just skip to the end. I think this is an important one because logical properties are basically something that was broken in the original CSS, because CSS was developed with the English language in mind, which means that everything flows from left to right, top to bottom. But that might also might not always be the case. So if you are coming from a different culture, left to right is not necessarily the norm, and logical properties fix this for us. Going to this, so if you see the margin right, margin top, these are addressing the flow of the document, and from a left to right perspective, that works. But if you are coming from a right to left perspective, it falls apart. So if we take a look at this example, we have a width, a margin right, padding top. That only makes sense if you are coming from a English culture, so to speak. What you can do or need to do, I was going to say, I think we all should do this. We should swap this out for the logical properties because they support the logical flow of the document rather than the directional flow. And this means that if you change anything going from left to right, you have an horizontal line, you start using the inline notation. If anything goes vertical in your traditional left to right, think that you are going in a block direction. And then the start to end, that marks the start of the flow or the end of the flow. And I think this is one of the most important ones because this was broken in CSS. And most of us didn't realize this until we start using it when affecting the direction of the document. And let me quickly skip a couple of slides. I have more, but I have too little time. That's very unfortunate because I was going to the animations and the text wrapping. But let's go to the end because so we have all seen a couple of features now. Well, what should you do now? And trust me, as I said, the rabbit hole is a lot deeper and there are a lot more holes to uncover and find. Because browsers are doing a really good job in promoting and adding new CSS features. So what should we do as a collective developer community? Well, I can only speak for our organization, and we are definitely going to look into adopting new properties and notations. And this will be an iterative approach because we have everything built on SAS now. We can't just remove that build step. But what we can do is we can start using the plain old CSS notations inside of our current build step. And over time, I think we will eventually get rid of SAS because for the most part, we don't use it or we don't need it anymore. And things like functions and mixins, they are also coming to the CSS spec. So it's going to be a wild ride. Few minutes over time, but my bottom line here is that I, for one, and I think I'm not the only one, we haven't been given CSS the attention that it should have deserved, but we know better now. And if you are in a similar situation, I advise you to take a good look at how your CSS is organized in your organization and whether it is in line with current support and standards. And I don't care how you write it, whether it's plain CSS, SAS, or Tailwind, but take a look at standards because if we let the browser do all of the work, it will be so much easier to maintain. Thank you for your time. If you have more questions or input, find me on the internet. I'm pretty approachable.
All right, thank you so much, Joran, for that amazing CSS talk. Wait, I have to fix my CSS. There we go. So we're in a center.
Bit of offset going on there.
Yeah, like how to center an Alex. It's not that trivial apparently. No. Nevertheless, yeah. Thanks a lot for that amazing talk. It was nice to see like all the new tiny bits of CSS that makes using CSS even more fun. No matter, as you said, what you use. If you use a preprocessor, if you use like Tailwind or Panda CSS, or just write it in BAM pretty plain. So yeah, are you ready for some questions?
It depends on the questions, but I'll give it a good shot.
Okay, let's start with a simple one. Can you, maybe not, let's see. Can you provide a practical example of when you've seen CSS layers used in a real world project?
Well, that's going to be easy. I'm not right now, but I have been experimenting with it. And I think it has a couple of really good possibilities of indeed working with third-party CSS or third-party vendors, tools, libraries. It makes it really interesting to start importing them into a layer so that you have more control. I think one of the best use cases I can come up with on the spot is if you say you have some third-party payment provider or a widget or something that just loads in via JavaScript and might also provide you with some CSS. If you can load that into your own layer, you have much more control over how that thing will behave. Yeah, so that would be somewhat of a use case. I haven't dealt with this in a production environment, unfortunately.
But maybe that's coming soon, and I think that's a very sane case. I mean, all of us remember, or most of us remember, like Bootstrap and like important everywhere because we want to override things. So layers could be a help there for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Nice. Then, of course, you mentioned lots of amazing new features, but what experimental CSS features are you most excited about?
Yeah, so the animations are really good. I had to,
Yeah.
I will add them to the slides and I'll put the slides online somewhere. But the animations are really good. And they are really good because they, again, also offload a lot of the calculations out of JS, where we traditionally do animations, and just let the browser render it. You have so much more GPU power when you leverage your animations to the browser. So that's something that's really exciting. Like the view transitions, there's a lot. So long story short, uncovering all of these properties was already a wild ride because, as I mentioned, I wasn't paying attention for quite some time. We were really happy with what SAS could do for us. We could render our UIs perfectly fine, even pixel perfect in some cases. But then, there was not a good need of diving deep into the current capabilities of CSS. So this has been an eye-opening experience for me. That's also one of the reasons I wanted to share this, because I think I'm not sure, but I think this goes with more developers. And it's
Definitely.
sort of, yeah, I think it's also, I'm going on a rant here maybe, but it might also be because we are the frameworks are so good and we can use the frameworks to build out applications real quick, but they also not just towards more JS orientated solutions. That was what we are doing, and that's perfectly fine because we can build really good user interfaces, but it sort of creates a blind spot for anything that CSS can do. And with the current capabilities, I think it's in a really good spot. It's in a better spot than when IE6 died.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And I mean, there's so many more things coming, like all the JS features you needed JavaScript for now can move to HTML, like with all the APIs coming. That's yet another topic, but same idea. Like the standard is getting more and more powerful, and I also like to see that because less JavaScript ship is always nice with the same feature set.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Yeah.
We have one more, which is we have a couple more actually. Do you have any tips on refactoring an existing project to take advantage of these modern features you just listed?
Yeah, so I quickly touched upon it, but what we are going to move towards is to have take a look at our SAS files. They are still perfectly viable because they still do a good job. So why change them, right? But if we want to introduce new features there, it's just a matter of starting to slowly rewrite SAS. Adding CSS variables instead of your SAS variables is a small step, but it leverages a lot of the calculations and capabilities already to the browser. So take small steps of pieces that you can start to use. And that can also be just on regular, if you use a component-based approach like we are, it can be just in one component. That's perfect. If that component works, then you have a perfect use case of testing the water, seeing how it responds.
And you can ship it already. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So doing a big bang, I think nobody likes that approach. And that's not needed because with the capabilities of having more control over the scope, having control over more control over the layers, you can use a iterative approach, and that's much more viable, come to think of it, than it was, say, 6 years ago.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And I'm really happy to see that the standard is moving that way as well, like that we have these options now. Okay, you've already mentioned SAS quite often now, and you said like, okay, your SAS files that exist, like, okay, they're good, they work, right? Sure, migrating at some point, but what is your opinion about use cases for SAS files in like a greenfield application? So if we start new application, would you say like, yeah, SAS is the go-to? Do we need it?
So the typical answer is, of course, it depends.
Yes. Yes.
So, but this depends on availability of resources. If you have a greenfield application where you need to be quickly up and running, you have limited resources, and you have a familiarity with SaaS, then by all means go for it. But I think it's one of the key things I hope that people take away from this is it's okay to pick something, but it's also okay to revisit that choice and see if that choice is still viable for you today. One thing I mentioned is our component library or design system is built on Vue. That's perfect for our use case because it was built from our developers who had a need of sharing components, and that grew into a design system. If we were to build this from the ground up using web components and framework agnostic technology, then it would have led to a lot of investment in building the thing before we could use it. And now we are already using it and working with it and learning from it. So now we can make much better and informed decisions on what we should do with our design system and component library.
Makes sense. Like also the knowledge like gathered on the way of building it, like really helps to like make maybe a new or different decision once again.
Yeah, exactly. And there's no right or wrong. Even in SaaS, you can still use these CSS properties. Of course, it just compiles to CSS in the end. So if you want to use SaaS to quickly scaffold out a couple of classes or a theme for you, that's perfectly fine. I think there's no one who will object to that.
All right, perfect. And last but not least, are there any tools or resources that you recommend for learning and experiment with like the latest CSS features, the things you've shown, the things that might come up?
Yeah, so take a good look at what's happening on the socials, because from the browser vendors, they are posting a lot of stuff. There are a couple of websites. You find latest CSS and you will come up with numerous examples. And what I did during my investigation was just simply spin up a CodePen or a StackBlitz or whatever, and just quickly do a small prototype with a certain technology, or find somebody who already did the work for me and figure out how it works, because you don't have to. That's the good thing about web development, of course, is that we can not steal, but we can use the code that somebody else has written to take our learnings from it.
Open
so
source.
If you're interested, yeah, exactly. but use that, because that will help you in getting up to speed with understanding these features much faster, and then you can build it yourself. So that also depends on what you want to achieve, but getting to know them is definitely worth the investment.
Makes sense. I mean, also this talk is a great resource as well, so definitely use this one as well for discovering the newest features as you did now. So first step done. Now try them out, use them, I guess. Joran, thank you so much for that amazing talk. I'm glad we had you here talk about all the hotness in CSS, and that CSS is awesome.
Great, glad to be here.